The Mojave Desert does not hide people. It erases them. In June of 2018, three friends entered one of the most desolate stretches of the Mojave for a short overnight trip. They were not thrill-seekers, not survivalists chasing extremes. They were ordinary people with a plan that should never have ended in mystery. Only one of them came back. And when he did, his body told a story he could not. Daniel Reyes, Lena Park, and Marcus Hill had known each other since college. Their friendship was built on routine, shared meals, long conversations, small trips that broke the monotony of work and city life. This trip was supposed to be no different. 2 days. One campsite. A clearly marked route through a protected section of desert land. They left early on the morning of June 14th, their car captured on a gas station camera near the edge of the desert. The footage shows them laughing, buying water and snacks, unaware that this would be the last moment all three of them were seen together. They signed the trail log just before noon. Marcus joked about the heat. Lena noted the clear sky. Daniel added their expected return time, June 16th, before sunset. That entry would remain untouched. The first night passed without incident, or at least without anything that reached the outside world. There were no emergency calls, no distress beacons, no messages sent. The second night was when everything changed. Search and rescue would later determine that the group never left their campsite. There were no tracks suggesting movement deeper into the desert, no sign of an attempted hike. Their supplies remained largely intact. They didn't wander off. They stayed. When the friends failed to return, concern turned to alarm quickly. Desert trips operate on tight margins. Water, heat, and exposure leave little room for delay. Authorities were contacted the morning of June 17th. Search teams reached the campsite by late afternoon. What they found was wrong. The tents were standing, but unoccupied. Sleeping bags lay open, as if abandoned mid-use. A half-prepared meal sat untouched beside a cold fire pit. 3 backpacks were present. 3 phones. 3 sets of shoes. But only 2 sets of footprints surrounded the camp. And they did not lead away. They circled the campsite repeatedly, overlapping, intersecting, as if the people who made them had walked in confusion or in ritual. The third set of footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of the fire pit, as if the person had simply vanished where they stood. The desert offered no struggle marks, no blood, no sign of violence. Just absence. Search operations expanded rapidly. Helicopters combed the area. Ground teams moved outward in grids. Thermal cameras detected only heat radiating from sun-soaked stone. By the 3rd day, the case shifted from rescue to recovery. Then, on the 5th night, something impossible happened. At 3:42 a.m., a patrol unit on a remote desert highway spotted a man walking barefoot along the shoulder of the road. He was dehydrated, sunburned, barely conscious, and his skin, from his neck to his ankles, was covered in symbols. The man was Daniel Reyes. He was alone, and he could not explain where Lena and Marcus were, or why the symbols were still bleeding into his skin as if they were alive. Daniel Reyes did not collapse when the patrol car stopped. He stood there swaying slightly, eyes unfocused, as if the road beneath his feet was still moving. When the officer stepped out and called to him, Daniel didn't answer right away. He tilted his head, listening, not to the voice in front of him, but to something else. Only when the officer repeated himself did Daniel react. He raised his hands slowly. That was when the symbols became fully visible. They were not random scribbles or desperate scratches. They covered Daniel's skin in deliberate patterns, spirals, straight lines intersecting at precise angles, repeated glyph-like shapes arranged in bands around his arms, chest, and legs. Some looked freshly drawn, dark and raised. Others had faded into scars, as if they had been etched days earlier. There were no words, no language anyone recognized. Daniel was taken to a hospital in Barstow under police escort. Doctors immediately diagnosed severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, and acute psychological shock. But it was the markings that drew the most attention. Dermatologists confirmed that the symbols were not tattoos. There was no ink beneath the skin. The pigmentation came from surface trauma, pressure, abrasion, and chemical irritation. As if something had pressed the symbols into him repeatedly. When asked who did this, Daniel shook his head. "I did," he said. Then he stopped speaking. For the first 12 hours, Daniel refused water unless it was poured into a cup and placed on the floor. He would not accept it from anyone's hands. He flinched whenever someone stood too close to his bed. Nurses reported that he slept in short bursts, waking abruptly and scanning the ceiling as if expecting movement there. The first words he spoke voluntarily came just before dawn. "They don't like noise," he whispered. Investigators waited until a psychiatrist cleared him for limited questioning. When asked about Lena and Marcus, Daniel's breathing became shallow, his eyes fixed on a spot near the door. "I tried to remember them right," he said slowly, "but it changes when you say it out loud." Pressed for clarification, Daniel gave an answer no one was prepared for. "They weren't taken," he said, "they stayed." That sentence would appear in every report that followed. Search teams returned to the campsite with renewed urgency. This time, they weren't just looking for lost hikers, they were looking for context. They found it in the sand. Under a thin layer of wind-shifted dust, investigators uncovered symbols identical to the ones on Daniel's skin, arranged in wide circles around the fire pit. The lines were shallow but precise, drawn with something harder than wood, softer than metal. Inside the circles were footprints. 3 sets. Barefoot. The medical examiner confirmed that Daniel's feet showed extensive blistering and lacerations consistent with prolonged walking on hot sand, but only in straight lines. There were no signs of stumbling, falling, or erratic movement. He had walked deliberately, over and over. Satellite data from the night the group vanished revealed a brief anomaly, a localized drop in ambient temperature over the campsite lasting approximately 20 minutes. In the Mojave, where heat is constant and predictable, such a shift had no clear explanation. When Daniel was shown photographs of the symbols in the sand, he began to cry silently. "They were practicing," he said. "That's why we had to stay inside the lines." Asked who they were, Daniel closed his eyes. "Don't make them names," he said. "They notice that." By the end of the week, Daniel was transferred to a secure psychiatric facility. The official explanation released to the public was exposure-induced psychosis combined with survivor's guilt. Privately, investigators noted something else. The symbols on Daniel's skin were still changing. Not spreading, rearranging. And every time the lights went out in his room, he was heard whispering the same phrase into the dark. "They're almost finished." The symbols did not fade. That was the first thing that unsettled the doctors. In cases of self-inflicted marking, scratching, carving, chemical irritation, the skin heals in predictable stages, swelling drops, redness dulls, lines blur. Daniel Reyes's body did none of that. Over the next 48 hours, the markings sharpened. Not darker, clearer. High-resolution photographs were taken every 6 hours under identical lighting. When the images were overlaid, analysts saw minute shifts, angles tightening, curves straightening, repetitions aligning. The pattern wasn't spreading across Daniel's body, it was correcting itself. As if moving toward a final form. A linguistics consultant was brought in quietly under the pretense of evaluating compulsive symbol use. She studied the photographs for 3 days without speaking much. When she finally gave her assessment, it was cautious and deeply uncomfortable. "These aren't decorations," she said. "They're not expressive, they're instructional." She pointed to repeating bands around Daniel's forearms and ribs, segments broken into evenly spaced units, each variation slight but intentional. Think of them like margins, she explained, boundaries, constraints. The most disturbing element was consistency. The same symbol never appeared twice in exactly the same orientation. Every repetition was adjusted, refined, as if something were iterating, learning from previous attempts. When Daniel was asked about this, he reacted with visible fear. "They don't like mistakes," he said. "That's why it hurt less near the end." Pressed gently, he clarified. "At first, it burned, like fire ants under the skin. But when the lines got closer to right, it stopped hurting." The interview ended immediately after that. Meanwhile, the search for Lena Park and Marcus Hill intensified. Ground teams returned to the desert not just to find bodies, but to locate structure, anything that explained the geometry of the campsite markings. They found none. No stones arranged deliberately. No buried objects. No carved surfaces. The symbols existed only in sand and on Daniel's skin. Drone footage revealed something subtle but consistent. The ground around the campsite reflected heat differently within the circular markings. Not cooler, not warmer. Uniform. As if the sand inside the circles had been conditioned to behave the same way. Soil samples showed trace mineral alignment inconsistent with natural settling. One geologist described it as pressure memory, as if the ground had been compressed rhythmically over and over in the same paths. The desert, it seemed, had been used. Back in the facility, Daniel's behavior grew increasingly regimented. He began requesting his meals at specific times, arranging items on the tray into precise configurations. If staff moved anything, he became visibly distressed. One night nurse documented something she hesitated to report. Daniel stood at the foot of his bed for nearly 3 hours, arms at his sides, eyes open, breathing shallow and perfectly timed. When she asked him what he was doing, he answered without turning. "Standing where they can see me." When asked who they were, he replied, "The ones that don't have edges yet." That phrase triggered a deeper review of Daniel's initial statements. Investigators noticed a pattern. He never used singular pronouns, never described an entity, never gave it form. Only function. They watch. They test. They correct. According to Daniel, the first night in the desert had been quiet. Too quiet. No insects, no wind, no distant highway noise, just heat and stillness. The second night, the silence changed. It felt crowded, he said, like the air was full, but you couldn't see what was taking up space. Lena noticed it first. She asked why the stars looked wrong, too fixed, as if depth had collapsed. Marcus laughed it off until the fire stopped crackling. Not burned out. Stopped. That was when the ground markings began appearing, faint at first, like impressions pressed upward from below. Daniel said none of them remembered deciding to draw. They simply knew where to step. The rules came without sound, without language. Step here, don't cross there, stay inside the shape. When Marcus broke formation, just once, the symbols on Daniel's arm appeared instantly, hot and raised. Marcus apologized. After that, no one broke the pattern again. When investigators asked Daniel what happened to Lena and Marcus, he finally answered with more than a sentence. "They finished before me," he said. "That's why they're still there." No remains were ever found. But 6 weeks after Daniel's return, a desert survey crew reported something new near the original campsite. Shallow depressions in the sand, evenly spaced, forming 2 long parallel paths that led away from the circles and disappeared into open desert. No footprints, just impressions, as if something had walked there without lifting its feet. Daniel was shown the images. He covered his face. "They learned to leave without us," he whispered. After the discovery of the parallel impressions in the sand, the investigation took on a different tone. It was no longer framed as a missing persons case. It became a containment problem. The area surrounding the campsite was quietly restricted under the justification of unexploded ordnance testing, an excuse vague enough to discourage curiosity. Signs went up, maps were altered, rangers were instructed not to camp overnight within a 5-mile radius. No official explanation was given. Unofficially, people stopped going there because the desert had begun to behave incorrectly. The first reports came from surveyors tasked with confirming boundary markers. They described a sensation of being observed without direction, no single point of focus, no movement to track, just the certainty of attention. One surveyor later said, "It wasn't like something was watching me. It was like the place itself had decided I was part of it." Their instruments malfunctioned in subtle ways. GPS units placed them several hundred meters inside the restricted zone, even when visual landmarks proved otherwise. Compasses drifted by a few degrees and then corrected themselves, always back toward the campsite. At night, the temperature dropped faster than predicted, forming pockets of cold air that remained unnaturally stable, as if insulated. Meanwhile, Daniel Reyes was no longer improving. The psychiatric facility noted a decline not in mental clarity, but in identity. Daniel began referring to himself less frequently. When asked direct questions, he sometimes answered in plural terms, then corrected himself mid-sentence. I don't need that anymore." He stopped asking about Lena and Marcus entirely. Instead, he asked about the desert. How big is it really? Does it ever end? Are there places no one looks at anymore? Doctors believed these questions reflected trauma fixation. Investigators disagreed. Because Daniel knew things he shouldn't have. Without being told, he correctly identified the locations of 3 unreported survey anomalies. He described the shape of the parallel impressions before photographs were shown to him. And once, during an unrecorded moment, he traced a symbol on the condensation of a window that matched a marking discovered days later nearly half a mile from the original campsite. When confronted, Daniel appeared genuinely confused. "I didn't draw it," he said. "I remembered it." That distinction mattered. Analysis of the symbols, both on Daniel's skin and in the sand, revealed another pattern. They were never symmetrical. Every design favored progression over balance, as if symmetry were considered wasteful. Efficient. Incomplete. A mathematician consulted by investigators noted that several of the patterns resembled partial solutions, iterations stopping just short of closure. "They're not finished shapes," he said. "They're approximations." Approximations of what? No one could say. Then, in late August, something forced the case back into public attention. A couple driving through a remote stretch of the Mojave reported a man standing in the road just after midnight. They described him as tall, unmoving, and completely naked. His skin appeared pale and marked, though the headlights washed out detail. When the driver slowed, the figure stepped backward into the darkness without turning. Search units found no footprints, but they did find impressions. Long, shallow, parallel. Daniel was shown the incident report. For the first time since his return, he screamed. "They're not supposed to come here yet," he cried. "They don't know how to stop looking." After that outburst, Daniel was sedated and placed under constant observation. 2 days later, every symbol on his body stopped changing. They settled into their final configuration. And for the first time since June, the desert went completely quiet. No anomalies, no reports, no signals, as if something had reached a conclusion. The investigators feared only one thing: that whatever had learned to mark Daniel Reyes had finished learning from him. Silence did not bring relief. It brought structure. After the symbols on Daniel Reyes's body stopped changing, the investigation entered a phase investigators privately referred to as the after pattern, the period when nothing overt happened, but everything felt arranged. Daniel was calmer, too calm. He complied with routines without instruction, woke at the same minute every morning, ate the same portions in the same order, sat in the same chair, facing the same wall for hours at a time. Doctors initially celebrated the stability. Then they noticed something else. Daniel had stopped reacting to new information. When told the date, he did not acknowledge it. When informed of weather changes, he showed no interest. It was as if only certain variables still mattered to him, and everything else had been discarded as irrelevant. A neurologist, reviewing his behavior, made an unsettling observation. "He's not disoriented," she said. "He's optimized." At the same time, park authorities quietly logged a series of incidents across a wide stretch of the Mojave. None of them were dramatic enough to trigger alerts on their own. Together, they formed a map. A maintenance crew found rocks arranged in linear paths that did not follow natural erosion. A wildlife camera recorded an empty frame repeating for 6 hours, as if the lens were pointed at nothing but still receiving data. A ranger reported hearing footsteps that matched his pace exactly, always half a second behind. And then there were the symbols. They began appearing again. Not in the original circles. Elsewhere. Small, incomplete, etched lightly into sand, dust, and dried lake beds, never finished, always abandoned partway through, as if whoever made them was testing surfaces, not messages. Each new marking shared a similarity with Daniel's final configuration. Investigators realized something chilling. The symbols were no longer instructions. They were copies. When Daniel was asked, carefully, indirectly, about the new markings, he didn't deny knowledge of them. "They don't need me to draw anymore," he said. "I already showed them where the lines go." Pressed further, he explained what he meant. "The desert is big," he said, "so they practiced on us first." That sentence marked the first time Daniel included Lena and Marcus in weeks. Search teams returned again to the original campsite, this time with ground-penetrating radar and soil displacement sensors. What they found beneath the sand was subtle but undeniable: repeated compression in narrow, parallel bands extending outward from the fire pit area. Paths, not tunnels, not footprints, paths of pressure, as if something had learned how to move across the desert without lifting itself off the ground. The lead investigator summarized it in a memo that would never be released. Whatever interacted with the victims did not remove them, it reconfigured them. 2 were retained, 1 was returned as a reference. By September, Daniel began requesting to go outside at night. Not walks, not recreation, observation. He stood in the courtyard of the facility, head tilted slightly upward, eyes half-lidded, breathing slow and measured. Staff reported that during these moments, electronic devices nearby behaved strangely, screens dimmed, clocks lagged by seconds, motion sensors triggered without movement. One guard swore he heard someone else breathing. Daniel never spoke during these sessions. But afterward, he always returned to his room and wrote the same symbol on a piece of paper over and over until the pencil snapped. That symbol had not appeared before. It was new. When analysts overlaid it onto satellite maps of the Mojave, the shape aligned with something no one wanted to acknowledge. A route, leading away from the original campsite, leading outward, toward places where people lived. The route Daniel Reyes drew did not point to a single destination. It branched. That was the first problem. When analysts traced the symbol against satellite imagery, it became clear that it wasn't a straight path through the Mojave. It was a decision tree, a series of shallow deviations that aligned with human infrastructure. Roads, service corridors, dry riverbeds that funneled movement toward towns. The desert, it seemed, was no longer practicing in isolation. It was preparing to interface. Authorities classified the finding immediately. Daniel's access to writing materials was revoked. His nighttime observation sessions were suspended. For the first time since his return, Daniel resisted. Not violently. Logically. "You changed the rules," he said. "That makes them curious." Within 48 hours, the first breach occurred. A freight train traveling through a sparsely populated section of the Mojave performed an emergency stop after sensors detected an obstruction on the tracks. The conductor reported seeing something long and pale stretched across the rails, unmoving. By the time response crews arrived, the obstruction was gone. There were no impact marks, no drag signs, no footprints, but the ballast stones between the tracks showed compression in long, parallel bands, identical to those near the campsite. 2 nights later, a truck driver pulled into a rest stop just after midnight and found the bathroom lights already on. Inside, every stall door was open. The mirrors were fogged, though the air was dry and cold. On one mirror, drawn through condensation, was a partial symbol. "Not complete. Testing." The driver left without using the restroom and reported the incident to Highway Patrol. The report was logged and forgotten. Until the audio surfaced. A dashcam from the truck recorded faint sound during the stop, too quiet to notice in real time. When amplified, analysts identified rhythmic noise beneath the engine idle. Breathing. Not the driver. Synchronized. Back at the facility, Daniel became agitated. "They do like when you close things," he said repeatedly. "Open means allowed, closed means challenge." Doctors increased sedation. It had little effect. That same week, emergency services received a call from a woman living alone on the edge of a desert town. She claimed someone was standing in her backyard, copying her movements. When officers arrived, the yard was empty. But the ground was marked. Not with footprints. With pressure, long, shallow impressions arranged in careful arcs around the perimeter of her house. None approached the doors or windows. They simply encircled the structure. Watching. The pattern matched one of Daniel's earlier configurations. Investigators now faced an unthinkable possibility. The interaction had moved beyond the original site, beyond the desert itself. Containment protocols were drafted quietly. Certain areas were placed under increased surveillance. Emergency radio channels were adjusted to filter specific frequency bands, ones that had shown anomalous interference months earlier. It didn't help. On October 3rd, the symbols appeared inside the facility. A janitor found them in a stairwell that had no windows and no external access. Thin lines etched into concrete dust, incomplete and misaligned, as if whoever made them was still learning how hard to press. Daniel saw the photographs and closed his eyes. "They're close enough now," he said. "They won't need me soon." When asked what would happen then, he answered with something that finally broke the clinical detachment of the room. "They'll stop copying," he said, "and start choosing." That night, every camera in the west wing of the facility went dark for exactly 90 seconds. When they came back online, Daniel Reyes was still in his room. Standing, facing the wall, breathing in perfect time with something no one else could see. After the 90-second blackout, the facility changed. Not structurally, not administratively, psychologically. Staff members reported a persistent sense that hallways felt longer than they should. Doors seemed farther apart. Sounds carried oddly, footsteps arriving a fraction of a second late, voices echoing where acoustics said they shouldn't. Daniel Reyes stopped speaking altogether. He still followed routines, but no longer because he was instructed to. He moved as if anticipating the next step before anyone else thought of it. Nurses noticed that he began standing in corners where two walls met, aligning himself precisely with the angles. Always the same angles. When doctors attempted to reintroduce questioning, Daniel responded only once. "They don't take everyone," he said quietly. "Some people are better where they are." That sentence forced investigators to revisit what Daniel had said months earlier. They stayed. Until then, it had been interpreted as resignation. Now it sounded like classification. A classified task force assembled to review all unresolved desert disappearances within a 500-mile radius over the past 20 years. The results were disturbing. There were clusters. Not random. Not seasonal. Clusters of missing persons whose last known locations aligned loosely with the same invisible corridors Daniel had drawn. In nearly every case, searchers reported something similar: intact campsites, vehicles left behind, no signs of struggle. And in 3 cases, previously dismissed as unreliable, there were survivors. Each had been found days or weeks later, disoriented, dehydrated, unable to account for missing companions. Each displayed compulsive behaviors. Each reported silence. Each used the same phrasing when pressed. "They're still there." Those survivors had never been compared before. Now they were. Medical records revealed faint scarring on their bodies, patterns once dismissed as rashes, sun damage, or self-inflicted scratches. When overlaid digitally, the scars aligned into incomplete versions of the same symbol set found on Daniel Reyes. Daniel was not the first. He was the most complete. In the desert, investigators returned to the original campsite one final time before permanently sealing the area. What they found beneath the sand made further visits unnecessary. Ground-penetrating scans revealed elongated voids just below the surface. Not tunnels, not caves, but negative impressions, as if something had rested there repeatedly without displacing material. Forms without edges. The shapes suggested bodies, but not human ones. The task force concluded, without writing it down, that the desert corridor functioned as a filter. A place where patterns were tested against human behavior. Some individuals adapted more readily, some resisted. Those who adapted were altered. Those who didn't remained. On November 12th, Daniel Reyes requested one thing: a mirror. When staff refused, he did not argue. He simply nodded and stood facing the wall, hands at his sides. An hour later, a nurse glanced into his room and froze. Daniel's reflection was visible. But Daniel was not facing the mirror. The surface showed the outline of a body standing behind him, taller, thinner, slightly misaligned, as if the reflection belonged to something that had learned his shape, but not his proportions. The nurse screamed. Security rushed in. The mirror shattered. Daniel collapsed to his knees, gasping, not in pain, but in relief. "They don't need to pretend anymore," he whispered. That night, every survivor file in the task force database was flagged simultaneously. No access attempt logged, no breach detected. Just one line of text added to each case summary. Status stable. No one authorized it. No one could remove it. And in the desert, far from cameras and roads, new pressure marks appeared in the sand. Not searching. Not copying. Waiting. The official conclusion was written carefully. 3 friends entered the Mojave Desert. 2 were lost to environmental exposure. 1 survived with severe psychological trauma. The report closed the case. Reality did not. After the mirror incident, Daniel Reyes was moved to a different facility under a different name. No public records listed where. Staff were rotated frequently. Rooms were redesigned to remove reflective surfaces, sharp angles, and predictable layouts. It changed nothing. Daniel no longer needed symbols. Doctors noticed that his skin, once covered in markings, had healed completely, too completely. No scars, no discoloration. It was as if the surface had been reset. But his behavior retained the pattern. He avoided symmetry. He positioned himself slightly off-center in every room. He slept in intervals that never repeated. When asked why, he answered once quietly, "Symmetry is inefficient." The task force disbanded in early 2020. Funding was redirected. Files were sealed. The Mojave corridor was permanently closed under the guise of conservation efforts. Satellite coverage of the region was quietly reduced. And yet, reports continued. A farmer found lines pressed into his field overnight, long and shallow, forming shapes that vanished by morning. A child in a desert town drew symbols in chalk she claimed she had seen in her sleep. A hiker reported standing figures in the distance that vanished when approached, not running, not hiding, simply failing to remain aligned. None of the reports mentioned Daniel Reyes. None needed to. In April of 2021, a wildfire swept near the original campsite. When the flames passed, investigators surveying the burn zone found something that should not have survived. A patch of untouched sand, perfectly circular. Inside it, the ground bore faint impressions, 3 positions. 2 deep, 1 shallow, as if something had waited there. And then left. Daniel Reyes disappeared 2 weeks later. No alarms were triggered. No cameras recorded movement. No doors were opened. His room was found exactly as he had left it. Except for one thing. On the wall, traced faintly in dust, was a final symbol, simpler than the others, almost crude. When analysts overlaid it with earlier patterns, they understood. It was not a mark. It was a correction. The desert did not take Daniel Reyes. It finished with him. Lena Park and Marcus Hill were never found because they never returned to being lost. They stayed where the rules were clearer, where patterns mattered more than names. And somewhere beyond the Mojave, past roads, past towns, past places people believed were empty, something that learned from 3 friends continues to move. Not hunting, not hiding, practicing, waiting for the next place quiet enough to listen.